Move around.
Probably. I try not to move around, but
Great.
I'm not very good at not moving around. So.
Hide floating meeting controls. I need to do this.
All right, is this on?
Yes.
Yes?
It might need to be a little closer, a little further up if there's a spot maybe on your scarf, Rebecca.
How's that? Is that better? No?
No, you're good.
I'm the only thing keeping you
Perfect.
from lunch.
You can advance.
Not sure if that's worse than being the person that goes after lunch when everyone's sleeping, but we'll just give it a try here. I'm going to try and stay close here and not wander wildly like I usually do for anyone who's been in class with me. First off, thanks so much for inviting me. I have a bunch of kind of acknowledgements that I want to start out. The work I'm going to talk about was funded by Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund and some intern funding from Lake State's Fire Science Consortium in partnership with DNR and the University of Minnesota. I want to start by making land acknowledgement for, Evan did this for where we are here on site. I want to acknowledge the land on which the work I did was done. This is land that were historical, traditional, and contemporary lands of Anishinaabe and Dakota people. They were acquired by the U.S. government in the areas I worked in two treaties, the 1854 and the 1855 treaty. And I think it's important to do this kind of land acknowledgement, but it's only a first step. And so I make that land acknowledgement as one part of a range of activities that in my professional career that is working towards more inclusion and centering of the voices of the people whose land on which I work. I work also with Lee Freilich, who's here in the room, is a collaborator. Charlotte Roy from the Bemidji office and Lindsay Chartel are also partners in this project, and I want to acknowledge their contributions. This work was actually largely done by two graduate students, Annie Hawkinson and Lori Knosola, and an amazing field crew. How many people have spent time in lowland brush ecosystems, which is what I'm going to talk about? Just a few, but everyone who works in these ecosystems I would call kind of heroes in that they're not easy to work in. So I acknowledge all these wonderful folks that have busted their butts out there for me, collecting the data I'm going to share with you today. Oh, and I can't forget, this is a burning talk. It's a project related to burning. So acknowledge the folks that made those burns happen, the staff at the DNR and their burn teams, without which this project also would not have happened. So brushlands. I need to say lowland brush. I'm going to embarrass myself here by saying when I first got asked to get involved with this project, I was thinking hazel brush, not sites where I would be in thigh waders walking like this from place to place. They're actually a really amazing ecosystem. They constitute, parts of them are these more sedge meadows, grass and graminoid dominated, and then these areas of willows and tall shrubs. And they're very heterogeneous. So this is a landscape that is really a mix of those tall shrubs, these grassy areas, and then shrubs in different stages. It's really that heterogeneity that I'm going to hope to convince you is an important piece of this ecosystem. They're wet. I need to remind everyone, I put this slide just to remind people, this is what it often looked like. They're wet and they're really dynamic. So we might be out one week and be this deep in water, and the next week it'll be at our ankles. So very dynamic changing water table, which created some challenges in terms of some of the traditional field methods in fire and vegetation surveys. In the ECS, many of the areas we worked are these northern wet meadow cars as their classification. And I put this up mostly to show that, and for those in the other room, that these do occur up in the aspen parkland, even though the study I'm going to be talking about occurred down here. Why do we care about brushlands, these open landscapes? Well, they're really important areas in terms of wildlife and managing wildlife. These are just some pictures from our field work. It's an important habitat for a lot of, for birds, both migratory and non-migratory birds. It's a critical habitat for a number of fur bearers. And there was an impressive level of insect diversity, just anecdotally walking through these areas. Over 250 species of wildlife use this. 80 of these are on Minnesota's species of greatest conservation need list. 38 of those are bird species. And this is also a habitat that's important for fire-dependent birds, which I think is why I'm here today. Fire dependent, that it's a wetland, right? Well, one of the key things that keep these landscapes open, even though they are wet ecosystems, were fire and are fire. And without fire, this is kind of where the ecosystem goes, is very dense, homogeneous, and tall shrubs. And I don't know, there is a person in this picture. And so the goal of a lot of management of these systems is really to keep these dense, tall shrubs at bay and maintain open habitat with this goal of supporting this diversity of wildlife. And much of this is done through prescribed burnings in spring or dormant season burns, which we've heard quite a bit about today especially. And we also have heard a lot about resprout potential in these dormant season burns. And so this is just an example of some post-burn pictures after a spring burn. We see 3 weeks later, pretty profuse resprouting in these willows. And then by 3 months post-burn, they're almost as tall as the dead sticks from those that were top killed in the burn. Historically, fire occurred in multiple seasons. We don't know a lot about the fire regimes in these because there aren't really trees to keep records of fire history in these sites. But if we think about the greater landscape and what we've seen in other talks, we know that fires occurred in other times of the year. And so a key question going into this project was really, could summer and fall burns be more effective at meeting the manager's goals of managing these brushlands and reducing that tall brush? And so to do this, we did an experiment that really actually focused on vegetation responses and then looked at breeding songbird responses to seasonality of burning as well. Our sites occurred actually just to the west of us here, the closest site. We're here, and it was over here. Up to the north, the triangle between kind of Cloquet, Hibbing, and Aiken. At each site, we had 4 different burn units, a control where we didn't have burn, and then the 3 different seasons. Each of these units is about 100 acres in size. And within those units, we had 8 sampling points where we sampled songbirds. And these are habitats I didn't mention, but that are important for grouse, because grouse habitat uses is much larger than our burn units. We focused on the songbirds where we felt like we could get a better sense of their response to fire. We had 10 successful burns, 4 of them. So there was 4 sites. We got all 4 sites got spring burns. And then our 3 of the 4, well, all 4 sites got several of the other seasons. So we have 1 site that has all 4 seasons, and then some that have, one has spring and fall, one has spring and summer. So I think all in all, this was really successful in terms of the number of burns we were able to get out there on the landscape. We tried to use actually some more phenological metrics of when to burn. So The spring burns tend to be before things were leafing out. The summer burns were active growing season, but tended to be late in the season, as you can see from the dates. And then the fall, we tried to do after there had been some kind of frost event. We surveyed vegetation and we surveyed burns, and we did avian point counts. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found. One of the things that was interesting about this ecosystem is that it hasn't been studied that much. So just our baseline conditions of what's there, both in terms of the vegetation and the birds were of interest. Probably the most common two species were slender willow and white meadowsweet. We found 12 species of willows and maybe more, given none of us were willow experts, although we became a lot better at willow identifying over the project. There was some glossy buckthorn, but in general, there wasn't a lot of invasive species, non-native species in here. If we look at the herbaceous, blue joint grass, calamagrostis was really very common, and there was a lot of sedges. There were more non-native herbaceous species in the site, but again, really patchy and not super common. Over the course of the study, we identified through the point counts over 105 different bird species. 26 of these are on the DNR as species of greatest conservation need list, and 21 of them occur on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium's list of fire-dependent birds. So a really diverse bird assemblage here. The common birds, common yellowthroat, swamp sparrow, these are highlighted with some of the conservation need common species. And fire-dependent sedge wren was like one of the most common things seen out there, and it was fun. Some of the students that were doing point counts really this was a new bird for them, and they got so sick of it after just the first day. And they're like, we never see these, this is rare. And it's like, well, you've never been in these lowland systems then. And we did find golden-winged warblers, which are of interest to a number of folks. Okay, so now to the actual burn and burn frequency data. So we tried a lot. We had a lot of intentions to collect a lot of interesting data on pre and post burn fuels and information. And the conditions at this site just foiled us at every turn. We might go out and fill up our big Duluth packs with a whole bunch of wet, heavy biomass and bring it back to the lab, only to have the burn happen like 2 weeks later and the water table be at a totally different place then. We did like, you know, and then you go back out and you're like, well, I clipped here, but now we're down here and like no idea where the surface layer, what's the duff. So we ended up in the end just using top kill as our metric to get a sense of the impact of the fire on the vegetation. So post-burn top kill surveys. One of the first things that one of the first kind of take homes is that the burns did not burn equally these areas. Our spring burns for those plots that we measured, 57 of the 64. So the majority of our plots burned in the spring, only half burned in the fall, in our fall burns, and less than half burned in our summer burns. So we had there was a lot less kind of fire across our landscape in these burns that were outside of the dormant season. And this could have been from the conditions. It could also be that this was new for the burn staff. They hadn't done, my understanding was they hadn't done this type of burn, and one of the managers said afterwards, we learned a lot from that first summer burn. So that's just something to think about. So one take home is different levels of areas burned, and this could be just because of the characteristics of the seasons, but it could also be implementation coming into play. So we have data on burn unit scale and then plot scale because we have this unequal effects of fire across the landscape. So two ways of thinking about it, across the whole landscape, and then where you were able to get burned, what happened. And I'm going to present data in that way. So at the burn unit scale, this graph just shows for the different seasons, the number of stems that survived and the number of stems that were top killed, and pretty similar to the pattern, I think, of how much of the landscape burned. We see that highest levels of top kill in our spring, which with smaller levels in these the two other seasons. So 75 to 45 to 25. When we look at the plot scale, it's a very different picture. When we hone in on the plots that actually did burn, we had high levels of top kill across in all seasons. There weren't in the 80%. So if you're able to get fire in there in fall and summer, you get similar levels of top kill on that shrubby biomass that you're trying to control. So that sort of sets the stage. Take home, less area burned in summer, but areas that burned had similar severity as measured by how much of the stems were killed by that fire. So how about vegetation response? What I'm going to show you is basically aggregate data of the shrub resprouting response. We also have some compositional data which we're still analyzing. So I'm just going to show you the response data of the aggregate shrubs. And I'm going to show a bunch of slides that look like this, so I'm going to walk you through it first. This is a change in stems per hectare for post and pre-burn. So if you're above the line here, there's more stems after the burn. If you're below the line, there's less stems. And then these are height classes. So we classified things in the different height classes to look at how effective the burns were at different height classes, as well as the potential for resprouting. And what I've highlighted here is the 1 to 2 meter height class, so these taller shrubs, and we see that both fall and spring burns seem to reduce these, which was one of the goals, whereas in summer we see less effects on those tall shrubs. And again, this is at the burn unit scale, so some of this is less of the landscape burned. When we look at burned only plots, the patterns are more pronounced. We get good change in stems 1 year post burn compared to pre-burn in this tall shrub category. But when we look at this small height class, this is our, I would call our resprout height class, this half-meter height class. What we see across, when we look at the full landscape scale, is a lot of resprouting in both the fall and the spring, and not so much in the summer. This is even more pronounced when we only look at the burn scale. So fall burns and spring burns both seem to stimulate resprouting. We get a lot of stems coming back in those, and we see less of that in summer. My expectation, I think other people have talked about this, is that in spring, we're dormant season, there's a lot of reserves to be able to resprout from. In fall, perhaps the plants have kind of slowed their growth and put down those reserves, meaning those reserves are there to resprout from the following year. Whereas in the summer, there's a possibility that their reserves are above ground, they haven't started storing up for the next year, and so there's less ability to resprout. And I would love to have some carbohydrate data as a geeky physiologist to really explore this more. So vegetation take home, spring and fall burns reduce our tall shrubs, but they seem to stimulate resprouting. How about the birds? What did we find in terms of the birds? So I'm going to show, this is similar, I think, to the veg, organized a little differently in that we have our unburned and then our spring, summer, and fall And this is, whoops, change in bird abundance or change in a particular species abundance. This is overall. If you're above the line, you're seeing more birds after the burn. If you're below the lines, there's less. So just a little orientation to these. And what we see is that overall, total bird abundance increases after burns compared to our unburned controls. And this increase is more pronounced in our summer and the fall burns. When we look at individual species, we see more diverse, quite diverse responses. So this is chestnut-sided warbler abundance. And for this species, there are more chestnut-sided warblers using these sites after the burns. And this is most pronounced in spring and fall burns. Yellow warblers, in contrast, we're finding them less after burns, and again, more pronounced in the spring versus the fall burns. Then we have species like swamp sparrow that seems to only respond to one particular burn. It's less abundant in our spring burns, but seems to be not any different than unburned in the other two. And veery, which is less abundant in summer. So diversity, diverse responses is kind of the take home that we found from the birds. And some of these responses we can tie to how the vegetation has changed. So based on our early data, the baseline data pre-burn, we were able to build models associated with which birds are more associated with different parts of the brushlands, the tall shrub areas versus the more open the grassy sedge areas. And for some of these species, they seem to track that. So if the burn makes the tall shrubs go away, there's less tall shrub species, but others, we don't know why they're responding in this way. So the wildlife take home is really that burning seems to increase bird abundance, but our species response were diverse across the season of burns. And at this point, you know, we're not exactly sure, that we don't have strong explanations for why that is. And so I started out with that key question about, our key question was, could these different seasons be more effective? And I kind of, at the end, have a changed question, and that is, what are benefits of adding burns in different seasons? So it seems to me one of our take-homes is that burns in different seasons have different impacts and results in terms of the vegetation, and that plays up to the wildlife community. And I'm going to skip that. Such that benefiting most birds, we want diversity out there, and a diversity of burn approaches and burn timing can add diversity to that landscape. So adding summer and fall fires can diversify your sites from a currently spring focused, and that will bring benefits in terms of wildlife. Why? My emojis didn't show up. I should have known this from the last time I gave this talk up here. I already kind of said this, burning in different seasons promotes a range of patches that vary in height. Different types of birds prefer different areas of brushland. Some like to hang out in those tall shrubs, some like those open areas. And so by fostering that diversity, you support that diversity of birds as well, which is just what I said. So we are now in phase 2. So everything I've shown you is 1 year post-burn. Right? What happens after that, right? Are these things sustained? Is this just a pulse? Is it, do we continue to see sort of, does the signal go away? Does the signal change? And so we are moving into a second round of funding for this project, thanks to the LCCMR, where we can examine 3 years and 5 years post-burn, which is my understanding that's kind of the window in which they tend to make decisions about how frequently to burn. And so this will give us a sense for, are these completely transient responses? How fast do things resprout? Does that summer signal stay beyond that first year? And hopefully give us a richer picture with which to think about decision-making around this ecosystem. And I finished with 4 minutes to spare.
Are you done yet, really?
I'm really done, so thank you so much for listening, and I guess we'll have questions in the question session.
Yeah, that's perfect, Rebecca. Thank you very much. Looks like our batteries are low. Yeah, thank you. All right, let's get to lunch. As a reminder from yesterday, dining hall's down here. Please try to make your way through relatively quickly. Everything seemed to go well yesterday, but if you can move your conversations outside the dining hall after you're done eating, and